Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, FY 2021 Rural Violent Crime Reduction Initiative for Law Enforcement Agencies, hosted by the Bureau of Justice Assistance. At this time, I'd like to introduce today's presenter, John Markovic, Senior Policy Advisor with the Bureau of Justice Assistance. John?
Welcome to today's webinar on the Bureau of Justice Assistance Rural Violence Reduction Initiative for Law Enforcement Agencies. Note that this is a new program for this year. It's focused on rural violence problems, which historically have not received as much attention as urban violence problems from the media, from the academicians, and probably from us as a funding agency. With this solicitation, we hope to remedy that. Today, I'll walk you through the core elements and the expectations and the requirements of this grant program. We'll have time at the end for questions, and we'll address as many of those as we can at that time. If we miss some, we can follow up by contacting you, or you can email me. So the things that we're going to cover today are the eligibility for the grant, the key elements that are expected for successful applications, the goals, objectives, and deliverables, what the funding levels are, a little bit of a discussion, what can be funded and what can't be funded. We'll talk about the important role of the training and technical assistance provider. We'll talk about the requirements, the minimal requirements that are required of all BJA grants, as well as the requirements specific to this solicitation. We'll talk a bit about the priority considerations in this grant, some tips for assuring the clarity of your submission for peer reviewers, the selection criteria that'll be used in selecting awards in this competitive award system, and the important dates and processes. So the first thing you'll obviously want to know is whether your agency is eligible for this award. As stated, the core focus of this solicitation is the reduction of rural violent crime problems. This application is open to county and local law enforcement agencies that are operating in rural areas and dealing with rural crime problems. If you're a municipal police department serving a town or village, you need to be serving in a rural population area, and your population should be less than 1,500 residents. That's checking with the most recent U.S. Census enumeration. So sheriff's departments that serve rural areas whose population is larger than 15,000 residents may apply, but they should address violent crime problems that are specifically occurring in rural areas or with rural populations. Prosecutors' offices are also eligible for this award, and the same would apply. The population of the county may be more than 15,000, but the problem addressed should be a rural crime problem. So to be successful, you need to identify one or more crime problems in your jurisdiction that are affecting the rural population, violent crime problems. And you need to propose or develop, there's a typo there, I'm sorry about that, strategies to address that problem or those problems. You need not have all the strategies lined out and figured out. That's part of what you can do with your grant. You need to commit to track the impact of those problems over time, and you'll be working with the training and technical assistance provider on the implementation of that outcome tracking, developing your strategy, and preparing your internal documentation that the TTA provider will turn into a final report. To be successful, you should emphasize collaboration and data-driven approaches as appropriate. This could include victim-centered approaches, community collaboration, criminal justice partner collaboration, use of evidence-based strategies, perhaps working with research partners, and a commitment to problem solving is encouraged. Many of you are familiar with the SARA model, scanning, analysis, response, and assessment. That's a good frame of reference to look at how you should address your problems in this grant. So the overall goals of this initiative are to develop, implement, and assess strategies that will reduce rural violence through programs and approaches that are innovative, targeted, and adaptable. So we want you to develop approaches that are responsive to your particular urban violence problem with an eye toward sharing that information so that others may use it. And again, the technical assistance provider will play a major role here in assisting you. So your objectives are to deploy your agency resources such as personnel, services, and analytical tools to the identified rural violence problems. You should document how those personnel and resources will be used in furtherance of that crime reduction strategy. And again, you should, in your solicitation write-up, you should discuss how you will track project outcomes to determine if the violent crime reduction strategy or strategies have had an impact once they're implemented. Again, the training and technical assistance provider, which will have some expertise in research and impact assessment, will be working with you. So in terms of deliverables, you should show that you're able to document development and implementation of these strategies to reduce violent crime problems as part of your application. The nature by which you document those can be memorialized in whatever your agency uses as documentation, maybe policies, it may be reports, but there should be some sort of documentation you should commit to documenting your program and then working with the TTA provider who will ingest those descriptions of your solutions or your approaches to violence reduction in a final report across all the sites that are selected. You should provide tracking data on the violent crime outcomes before and after the implementation of your crime reduction strategy. And again, the format used may be similar to that involved in the SARA model, the scanning, analysis, response, and assessment approach to problem solving. And if you haven't heard it before, another redundant point, again, the TTA provider is there to assist you. We know that many of you may have different capacities in terms of assessment, and we want to meet you where you're at. The next thing we want to cover is the basic funding levels. Okay, the funding cap for this solicitation is $150,000 for each applying agency. There is no match requirement for this grant. The grant period is 36 months. We generally begin the fiscal year on or about October of 2021. So once you submit your application, they'll go through a peer review process. You'll be notified of your award before the October 1 date. In terms of a budget, there's a pretty open-ended on what you can spend your money on. We'll talk about the allowable and unallowable costs a few slides up. But the general idea is that your budget should be complete, cost-effective, and allowable. Okay, that the budget items should be reasonable. They should be allocated to the elements of your grant, the key core elements that you're going to put forth in your grant, and they should be necessary for the project activities. They shouldn't be extraneous to the mission of your violent crime reduction approach. Essentially, all expenditures should be reasonably related to the project goals, objectives, and deliverables. There should be some nexus to how you're spending your money and the violent crime reduction strategy. So here are some allowable costs and program activities. I think we're leaving a lot up to your imagination here. We know that the rural violent crime problems that you're going to be addressing may vary considerably based on the nature of your jurisdiction, but this would include programs that support victim services and community engagement. It could include salary or overtime expenditures for personnel integral to violent crime reduction operations. So that could be sworn or non-sworn staff. It could involve the procurement of crime analysis software or personnel or augmenting what you already have. It could involve consultation services related to the helping design your program, implement and assess the program. You may have research partners that you work with that you want to use in tandem with the TTA provider. It could involve the development or acquisition of vendor-based risk assessment tools to better target investigation, intervention, or enforcement. Similarly, you can use those tools, software assessment tools, to better serve and protect the community, to identify victims and vulnerable populations. So we're continuing on some allowable cost and program activities. These are not prescriptive. These are not the only programs that you can support. They're just suggestive of some of the strategies that you might use. We know that one of the problems in rural populations is serving in remote areas. So your funding could include ways and strategies to improve services to remote locations, providing services or shelters for remote populations. You can also use the money for strategies that mitigate the risk for violent behavior in individuals dealing with mental health or substance use disorders. It could involve the use of crisis intervention teams or programs to augment your law enforcement response. It could involve forensic tools and services for identifying suspects or enhancing evidence, testimony, and outreach to victims. So victim-sensitive approaches where you're working with service providers and victim service providers are all allowable. And it also can provide funding for opportunities for sharing data, for intergovernmental collaboration. For instance, you may want to work to stand up criminal justice coordinating councils to talk about problems facing your jurisdiction, be that addiction, treatment, victimization. You may involve public health professionals, other first responders, and so forth. Again, you're not really, we don't want to limit your imagination. It's just that there needs to be a reasonable nexus to what you're doing, how you're spending the money, the services, the software, and so forth, the equipment that you may be using to address those problems. And these certainly are not all of the ways that you can spend your money, just a flavoring of the ideas. Just the bottom line here is to remember that the cost, personnel services, contractors, software, whatever else you spend your money are allowable and directly support the implementation of your strategy. Here are some things that are now not allowed for the Rural Violent Crime Reduction Initiative and not allowed in many federal grants. Neither federal funds, and in this case we don't have matching funds, can be used for pre-award costs or expenditures. So you can't use the money to reimburse yourself for something you've already spent the money on. There is no allowance for land acquisition, construction projects, firearms or ammunition, armored vehicles, and generally other tactical equipment that's used strictly for law enforcement purposes. So if you wanted to get some flavor for some of our other rural initiatives, you can look at these two past programs. They are not specifically rural violence reduction programs, but give you some sense of what others have done, successful applications from rural organizations such as yourself. I mentioned that there will be a training and technical assistance provider, which is fairly standard in many of BJA's grants that are site-based. We will select a TTA provider to assist awardees. As I mentioned before, the goal of that assistance is to essentially meet you where you're at, to provide the assistance you need. But some of the standard things that the TTA provider will do is help you document your programs and processes, help you track your data and outcome, promote peer engagements. They'll look across sites and see who are doing similar things, connect you to people who are doing similar problems. They'll be They can provide research assistance. They can provide specialized training that they identify or you identify as you progress through your award. And they'll help identify promising practices from across sites. So we're going to be selecting this TTA provider through a competitive award system, and they'll be selected on their ability to provide targeted assistance, the assistance that the individual sites need. We'll be selecting them on their demonstrated expertise in addressing rural violence and their ability to ingest and then digest that information in a consolidated report at the end of the grant period. So here are things that every Rural Violent Crime Reduction Initiative application must include. There's a standard form called the SF-424 that must be included. That's basically establishing the parameters of your grant. Everybody has to provide a disclosure of lobbying activities, standard form LLL. In addition, every application should include a project abstract, and we'll talk a little bit more detail about what that entails, and a program narrative. You also need to provide a budget detail worksheet with a narrative supporting your budget items. That'll be submitted online this year, new through our JustGrants system. You provide a financial management and systems controls questionnaire. You'll provide any applications of any disclosure, a disclosure of pending applications for similar work. Are you seeking funding for this work from others, that other applications that are pending, so we're aware that you might be also seeking support from others on this award. And then a list of subrecipient agencies if partnership is proposed. That would be somebody who you're passing funds through. So for instance, a prosecutor's office may apply for this award, and then it might pass some money through to small, maybe to the sheriff's office and to some of the small municipalities within that within the county that serve rural areas. They would be subrecipients to the award, and they should be listed as such in your application package. So the project abstract should be no more than 400 words. It should be a summary of the proposed project such that a peer reviewer can read it and understand which service areas and which persons will be benefiting from the proposed work, what the primary activities, products, and deliverables will be. Abstracts this year are going to be submitted using the JustGrants web-based application. So the project narrative is the key document that really drives this competitive solicitation. This is where you get to explain your plan. It's not to exceed 10 pages, double spaced. That's with a 12-point standard font. We recommend you use Times New Roman. Use the general 1-inch margins. I would strongly encourage you, and we're going to get to these momentarily, to use the sections in a structured format when you submit these. Sometimes people will submit in single-space documents, and it will be a stream of consciousness without sections. We're not going to reject you if it comes in that way, but keep in mind that it'll make it much more difficult for the peer reviewers to review and make sense of your application and to check whether certain areas that they'll be scoring you on have been addressed if they have to reread things. So logical layout is important. You can use attachments. They don't count against the page limit, and some of the standard attachments are the resumes or CVs of key people, maybe a description of your agency or some material that you created that are related to your rural violence crime problem. Just a note down there is reiterating what I said, that if you closely follow this format, it'll be much easier for peer reviewers to understand and assess your agency's application. So if you submit the same thing as a stream of consciousness and you submit it with sections and formats, you'll do far better, I'm sure, in an organized format. And we'll see what that looks like in just a moment. And this is really how you should structure your narrative. It should be just broken down into these sections, which track closely with your scoring criteria. So you provide a description of the issue. What is the rural violent crime problem? How is it impacting your community? How you, basically a project design and implementation, how you propose to address that, how you propose to, what solutions you might have identified, or what process you might identify for addressing those solutions. You should discuss the capabilities and competencies of your agency and agency personnel and any partners you include in your application to achieve those goals. Plan for collecting the data required for this solicitation's performance measures. So we'll be asking you periodically, if you're awarded, to fill out a performance measurement questionnaire, which tracks with the grant. It's, what problems have you identified? Enumerate that problem. What have you done to address that problem? What have you done to look at the response, to assess the responses to those problems, and so forth and so on. So you should basically acknowledge that you're willing to track data for performance and identify a person or persons who will be directly responsible for that. That's always a good idea, to identify personnel within your department or the criteria for selecting those personnel, rather than say, we'll do this, but it's to be determined. You should provide plans for continuation of the program after federal funding has been expended. So at the end of the 3 years, should you be awarded at the end of the 3 years, you should be able to tell us how you will sustain this program. Okay, the budgets this year will be provided in the budget form in JustGrants. That'll allow you to provide the narrative for the budget items to provide context. But if you want to attach a separate budget narrative, if that form is too restrictive, if you feel like you need to say more, you can do that as an attachment. It will not be counted against your 10-page document size limit. And again, you ensure that the budget is cost-effective, reasonable, and directly related to the project objectives and missions. So performance management and reporting is something we require of all grants. I drill down on this quite a bit. So you'll be required to periodically submit this PMT, performance measurement tracking, through the life of the grants. You just should be aware of that and include that plan in your solicitation, and be very explicit that you will provide resources for performance management tracking. So there are certain attachments that you include if applicable. If you're doing an indirect cost rate agreement, I should provide that. That may not be that common in site-based solicitations. These are often the case when universities or nonprofits apply. They have an overhead for managing the grants. If you're a tribe, it'd be helpful to include your tribal authorizing resolution. If you are using researchers, and only if you are using researchers, you should provide documentation of research, evaluation, independence, and integrity. This is spelled out in more detail, as is everything I talked about in the solicitation itself. If applicable, memorandums of understanding or letters of support from sub-recipient agencies. So as I said, the prosecutor's office may be electing to engage in a violence reduction strategy and passing money through to, let's say, the sheriff's office and to small municipal departments within the county, they should get some sort of documentation that those agencies have agreed to collaborate with the prosecutor's office should they be awarded. And then the research letter, if you have a research partner, a letter of participation is advisable, but not mandatory. So this is basically the review criteria. These will be peer reviewed by people with experience in law enforcement, in grant administration, service providers that have been selected on the basis of the fact that they've done similar things to what's being called for in this grant, crime reduction, working with rural populations and so forth. So 10% of your score will come from your statement of the problem or description of the issue. The bulk will come from your project design and implementation, coupled with the capabilities and competencies of your organization. Your plan for collecting the required performance data, basically tracking outcomes, reporting to PMT is 20%, and your budget counts for 10%. So as you prepare your solicitations, keep those in mind, the relative weighting and how much attention, it'll give you guidance for how much attention you should pay to each section. And again, make sure that these sections are laid out in your proposal. You should also, as I mentioned before, it's not going to be something you're necessarily scored on, but do provide documentation of the continuation of the program. You don't necessarily have to provide a separate budget section that'll be covered in your budget and budget narrative. But you might want to make mention of the soundness of your budget and the fact that all costs relate, refer to your budget documentation and reinforce the fact that all costs are reasonably related to the goals and objectives of your program. So I think some of the major takeaways that I want to leave you with is that this is a competitive grant solicitation program. Okay, this is not merely an equipment purchase grant. Equipment, personnel, other resources are allowed as long as they're in support of the goals, objectives, and deliverables outlined here and set forth in your proposal. This is a 3-year-long grant program, so you should budget for the full 36 months. And just in general, the more you demonstrate an understanding of your jurisdiction's unique rural violence crime problem and your willingness to work with a TTA provider, the more favorable your proposal will be reviewed. Again, I want to emphasize this: formatting, clarity, and the organization of the matter that you provide. Organization all matter in your grant solicitation, in your grant proposal. So keep that in mind. The organization and the sections are key. I'm going to turn it over to Daryl now, who will speak to some of the technical issues with grants.gov and JustGrants.
Thanks, John. And actually, the next slide here for anybody that had questions, here's John's contact information. The host will post that into the chat section too if you need to cut and paste that for any specific questions. But as far as the application process is concerned, there's actually a 2-step process this year. And one is dealing with grants.gov, the system, which you should be familiar with if not already. A DUNS number is required within that system, and also a system for award management numbers, also registrations mandatory within that system. So that's going to be your first step. And then registering with grants.gov, there is a specific deadline, July 6th here, 2021, 11:59 p.m. It is definitely recommended to, if you can, get that in with at least 48 hours notice to this due date, just in case there are any technical issues that may arise. And then the actual application itself is going to be due July 20th, 2021 at 11:59 in what's called the JustGrants system, which is a new entity this year. And we'll get into that a little later on in this presentation. So the two main dates to take away from here are July 6th, 2021 and July 20th, 2021. As mentioned, it's a two-step process. So step one is the grants.gov, and what you're going to submit in there is the SF424 and the SFLLO, which is a lobbying activities form. So it's just going to be those two items in the grants.gov by that first deadline. And then as mentioned, step two is the full application, including all your attachments, budget detail worksheets and such. That's going to be in justicgrants.ustoj.gov. And any other specific information you need is going to be in the solicitation itself. That'll be posted in the chat section as well. The more comprehensive document relating to everything on the applications. Within JustGrants, they have posted what's called the DOJ application submission checklist. It's going to be your one-stop shop for all the necessary steps to complete this two-part application process in both grants.gov and JustGrants. How to prepare to apply, completing the abbreviated application in grants.gov, entity onboarding and JustGrants, how to get access. There's a lot of certifications and such with submitting your application in JustGrants that you'll need to know, and also user tips. So it's a really robust website that has a lot of good information, frequently asked questions that have been collected and cultivated over the months here as grants have been submitted. So it's a great resource and quite a database of information. Also, JustGrants has hosted many application submission webinars, application mechanics e-learning videos, which are now posted within the JustGrants site. There's going to be a wealth of information, and actually pulled several specific things out and have separate videos available. As you'll see on the right-hand side of this screen here, there's a getting ready to apply, which is a rather new one. The next one was initiating the application submission in grants.gov, so that aspect of things. How to locate applications, how to submit it, the budget detail form, which is new this year in there. And then even after submitting an application, what steps to take and what to record. So all these are available on the JustGrants website, which will be posted in within the chat section here. So please, for reference, definitely recommended to review these. How to stay connected to BJA. You can do email updates. You can just text OJP in your email address to 468-311. You can subscribe right there. Social media, BJA does have Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube accounts. If you need to contact or just reference anything there, you can access those links that'll be posted in the chat. And obviously BJA's main website. You can get a whole host of different funding opportunities, publications, training technical assistance links, and such from there. So it's definitely worth a bookmark to see what's coming out. Lastly, this is the important contact information you'll need as you're gathering things to apply and as you're going to apply. Each has a different function. So the first one listed here is grants.gov. If you have any technical assistance questions in submitting both those forms, the SF424 and SFLLO, please, you can go ahead and call them at 800-518-4726, or you can email them at support@grants.gov. They'll be able to assist you with anything related to those two. If you're getting into the full application on JustGrants and have questions, they have a wealth of information, as I mentioned, on their frequently asked questions training database site. You can also call them at 833-872-5175 or justgrants.support@ustoj.gov. Lastly, if you have information relating to the programmatic requirements of this solicitation, you can contact the OJP Response Center directly at 800-851-3420 or at grants@ncgrs.gov. And they'll be able to assist you with anything pertaining to the solicitation with the programmatic requirements as mentioned. And we'll keep this slide up as we get into the Q&A just for reference. And this will also be posted in the chat for easy capturing on your end. That brings us to the end of the presentation as of now. just a couple of housekeeping items. As mentioned earlier, the recording, transcript, and PowerPoint from today will be posted to the BJA website with approximately 5 to 10 business days. So you can look out for that. That link will be posted in the chat section. If you need to go back and reference anything that was mentioned today, you can. And with that, John, we can kind of go into the questions. There are a few populating. If you do have a question, on the bottom right-hand side of your screen, you can click on the 3 dots into the Q&A and send to all panelists. We'll be hopefully glad to answer those as they are coming in. So with the first question,
Great.
is population of a town 5,000 eligible to apply?
Yes, I would just, I think that's a great question. Probably something I should have mentioned before. So I did mention that this needs to be serving a rural area, and the population cap is 15,000. So as long as that 5,000 population is not in an urban area. So if it's a, it's a suburb of Chicago or Los Angeles, that's 5,000. You wouldn't be eligible. That's not a rural area, and you're not really addressing rural crime problems. But if you're serving rural areas and serving rural populations, you're certainly there. You'd be underneath the 15,000 population cap. So yes, you would be eligible to apply.
And if you want to note this slide here, slide 5, we'll go in a little more specifics and also the solicitation itself. So if you are referencing this once it's posted, you can just note slide 5. The next question is, are body-worn cameras an allowable expense?
Well, probably not. I mean, the nexus to crime reduction isn't clear, but that person should know that we have a separate body-worn camera solicitation that is out. And then this year we also have, in an effort to serve small rural and tribal populations, we will be having a MicroGrant solicitation, which will not be administered through BJA and JustGrants.gov and JustGrants. It's administered by an agency who's engaged in a cooperative agreement with us. That should be coming out in about a week. And that is, the body-worn camera program is eligible recipients for the body-worn cameras, any police department, regardless whether you're urban or rural or suburban, with 50 or fewer officers, sheriff's offices that are larger than that serve in rural/non-metropolitan counties, as well as any tribal agency. The rationale behind that grant program is that for our regular body-worn camera policy and development program, those small rural agencies were often not competitive. So we're doing a separate solicitation, which is a streamlined application process. The nuts and bolts of it is that it'll allow you up to $2,000 per body-worn camera. We know that the cost of body-worn cameras aren't $2,000 in and of themselves, but that allows you to implement the program and provide other equipment and support and services in response to the body-worn camera program. For that program, there is a match. It's a 1-to-1 match, which may be cash or in kind. So cash match is, if you were to propose to get 40 cameras, your agency would pay for 20, and you'd request 20 through the federal government. You can also, we actually encourage you to include other expenses, but those would be, you should match at least dollar for dollar on those. We recommend matching dollar for dollar, not going too far overboard in overmatching, but you can include in your cost of that program the services for personnel to manage the program, the licensing that's related to the body-worn camera purchase, the lease of those cameras, the ancillary equipment that you get with those cameras, mounting devices, the docs in which you would download the information, support services, so forth and so on. So That'll be coming out directly. If that person who asked the question wants to email me directly, please do so. And I'll make sure that the agency that's going to be running the MicroGrant program gets your information. I don't have it in front of me. There is a site to register on. If you email me, I'll send you that site so you can register with them, and they'll notify you when the grant application opens.
Does the start date for the grant have to be October 1st, 2021? For example, if this was a personnel-related grant, could it go into effect January 1, 22 instead of October 1?
Well, I think really generally the grant start dates will be determined once the grant is accepted. For reporting, tracking purposes, every grant in the solicitation will start October 1st, 2021. If for some reason you're not able to start, you can certainly propose things that way. I mean, then should the agency be awarded? Let me rephrase that. I think this is a good question. Sometimes we know it takes a while to start up and hire the people and bring them on. So we're not going to require you to hit the ground running on October 1st. The clock will start running. However, if you do start late, there are always opportunities for a grant extension, grant period extension, not more funds, but an extension of the grant period. And we usually deal with that towards the end of the grant. So, if for some reason you were to start late in this process, we can make accommodations should you be awarded. I think that answers the question. So, but the start date, essentially for reporting purposes is October 1st, 2021. Next question.
Can you review briefly for those that may be new to things on what TTA stands for?
Yeah, I'm sorry, the training and technical assistance. So generally we have, for many of our site-based grants, qualified organization that we select through a competitive process who will help you execute your award. This is particularly useful for smaller agencies that aren't that grant savvy, that don't have a lot of technical expertise and internal resources for research and evaluation. If you have them, by all means use them and include them in your proposal. Let's take a drink of water here. But keep in mind that training and technical assistance provider is there to help you. So as I said, they're going to be doing some standard things. They'll be working with you. They'll be helping you track your outcomes, maybe to find solutions to your problem. And then they'll also be working across sites. They'll connect you with peers who may be doing the same thing or similar things as you. So sort of provide for that cross-site learning experience. And then really their responsibility is to pull together the lessons learned and the commonalities from all these site-based awards. So you'd be expected to work with them. We're not sure exactly how the training and technical assistance provider will propose to provide those services. But in the Bodyworn Camera program that I run, they have regular meetings with the site-based grantees for the Bodyworn Camera. They help them develop their policy or assure that their policy is complete and comprehensive. And then pretty much they meet that agency where they're at and what their needs are. And again, they provide for some, basically connecting the dots between the programs and providing peer-to-peer support. So training and technical assistance, TTA.
Thanks for that, John. We are a small agency, 13 sworn, struggling to combat drug crimes. Would we be eligible under this program to receive funding to offset overtime and other costs associated with these investigations?
yes, you would be eligible. Just keep in mind the objectives and deliverables. So it should say something more than we really, really need this overtime to combat drug problems. You should lay out in your proposal how the use of overtime is expected to impact the drug crimes and how you will track that. You don't need to do a sophisticated research design, but you should commit to tracking that in some sort of quantifiable terms or even qualitative terms, if you're lessening the impact on victims, so forth, or providing services, getting people into services, however that might be, whether you're using an enforcement or a treatment or an intervention. You should really talk about how your approach will have an impact, not just that you need the money to combat drug crimes. But that certainly falls under eligibility criteria.
The grant mentioned a certification for safe policing for safe communities. Is there a template for this that anyone can access if they do not have one on file?
Say that again, Daryl, please.
The grant mentioned a certification for safe policing for safe communities. Is there such a thing in the solicitation?
No, but I think you mentioned that it does remind me that there are priority areas on this grant which have to do with protecting civil rights, serving high poverty areas. Those are really extra credit points. They're laid out in the publication or in the solicitation language itself. So, those would be things that if you're serving high poverty areas or addressing civil rights, that sounds like it might be a priority area. I'll have to check the grant. It's not coming to mind what that is. But if that person wants to email me separately, I can address that.
Yeah, John, actually, we could definitely make a referral for that person to contact the OJP Response Center. Contact information listed here. Probably be recommended. That way it'll get on file and then the response can be created for you. So definitely would recommend that.
Yeah.
The 2020 enumerated census results will not be out until December. Can we use the ACS 19 estimates?
Yes, use the latest census data that exists for your enumeration, your enumeration area. So yeah, use the latest census data.
Are security cameras to be used on our new bike trails allowed, as well as bait bikes?
As well as what bikes?
Bait, B-A-I-T, decoy.
Bait bikes. I think, that's allowable expenses. I think you need to provide, the agency would need to provide a nexus to how that will, how that impacts rural violence and what type of impact you think it might have and how you might measure it, but it's certainly allowable, yes.
It was mentioned this grant did not cover expenses already incurred. Were you referring to expenses incurred before the grant was awarded? Can you clarify if this grant is intended for reimbursement requests or funds provided up front?
So yeah, generally, the grant only covers expenses incurred during the grant period. So you can't reimburse yourself for things that you might have bought before you applied for the grant or that you bought in anticipation of the grant. As with all federal grants, you also can't use this for supplanting. So if you budgeted for a particular item, your agency budgeted for a particular item, you can't say, okay, we're going to now apply for a grant for those funds because you've already budgeted for that. This is for new items. That would be called supplanting. So this is not a reimbursement grant. And it's not, and you shouldn't supplant, and you shouldn't before the grant period begins or in anticipation of being awarded. that's not allowable.
Are automated license plate readers allowable projects?
Yeah, I think that would, again, it's allowable. I think the agency needs to provide the nexus to the violent crime problem and how the implementation of that technology would help resolve the violent crime problem, impact the violent crime problem. Violence crime problem.
Could the funds be used for salaries in a community policing initiative in a concentrated areas where the violent crime issue is prevalent, focused on increasing patrols in those areas specifically?
Yes, I think that would be fine. I think, to the extent that the agency shows that they're using a community policing approach and targeting hotspots, and we'll be having, anticipating to have some impact on violent crime incidents. Yeah, that is certainly allowable.
Are entities are allowed to apply for multiple grants such as this in, say, the Bodyworn Camera initiative?
Sure. There's nothing that would prevent you from applying for this grant for rural violence crime reduction and applying for Bodyworn Camera grant. There aren't overlaps between the programs, so you wouldn't, that's allowable.
Just regarding eligibility again, the solicitation, the population served must not exceed 15,000. Is that the total population of a town to be considered rural, or just the crime population that we will serve?
For the town, so if you're a town of 20,000 that's in a rural county, you're not eligible. You have to be 15,000 or less. That's the cap. So it applies to any municipality, town, city, has to be under 15,000, regardless of where they're located. The exceptions are city, counties, and county prosecutors that are serving in rural communities, but the population is over 15,000. They are eligible, but they need to direct their services to the rural parts of their county or the rural population.
Several more questions on equipment purchases, and the one question kind of sums it up. For clarification, this grant should not be used specifically to purchase equipment related to the reduction of violent crime in rural areas, but those types of purchasers are to assist in a project or create policy to reduce these violent crimes in rural areas. Is that correct?
Right. So, yeah, I think the critical consideration here, you shouldn't merely use this. The purpose of this solicitation isn't merely to purchase equipment or hire personnel. They need to be tied to some sort of violent crime reduction program. We don't put a specific percentage or dollar amount on that other than the $150,000. So, it could be used for resources or software. I mentioned crime analysis or victim services. It could be used to hire personnel or buy equipment that'll help you achieve those goals, but it just needs to be bundled in a crime reduction strategy. I hope that makes it clear.
If somebody has gone in and started to apply, can they go ahead to modify that specifically with the amount requested?
They can go in and modify as long as their application is still in draft mode, and that's really a question for the JustGrants folks. It's a new system, and I'm not, technologically proficient in it. I'm really kind of addressing the substantive, the goals, objectives, and deliverables here. But, so by my understanding, if you're still in draft mode, you can modify that. It's not until your final package is submitted that you wouldn't be able to access your application. But that would be a better question for the JustGrants folks. They will tell you when sort of the application is submitted.
Yeah, in this slide, definitely jot down the phone number and email there for the JustGrants technical assistance line. More specifics on that.
So let me just, I don't know if we have any more questions, Daryl. So I think the first place you should go with programmatic requirement questions is the last one down there is the OJP Response Center at grants@ncjrs.gov. They'll be able to answer questions for you. I've got limited bandwidth, so I would try to answer the questions for you. If you email me directly, I did make mention of the person who's looking for body-worn camera grants to email me directly. I will try to get the things if you email me directly, but I think it's best that you start with the 1-800-851-3420 number or email them at grant@ncjrs.gov. They'll be able to filter the questions. Some of them they'll be able to answer. And if they can't answer, if they cannot answer them, they will contact me and I'll respond to you through them.
Thanks, John. Yeah, that seems to be it for today. So we're coming up at 3 o'clock. Unless there's anything else, John.
I think that's it. Thank you to Tammy Ando and Daryl Fox who set this up, and please reach out for assistance and please submit your grants abiding by the timelines, and I look forward to hopefully talking to some of you again when you receive your awards. Thank you.
Okay. So on behalf of the Bureau of Justice Assistance and our panelists, we want to thank you for joining today's webinar. This will end today's presentation.